About 11 months ago, I had uploaded my first video onto YouTube, finally mustering the effort to start making videos after countless hours of consuming the content of others, taking notes of what they did, how they formatted their videos, all the while finding my own identity on YouTube. Since then, I have come a long way, and I still feel like I've really only started. But that's just the nature of this platform. There is always potential for growth, and like the world of gaming, it's always growing, changing, or alternating? So what do I mean by that? Well, there are countless subcultures within the technology realm, and there are many spectrums as to what software is being created, either advancing things forward or recreating what was done before. Technology and gaming have one thing in common, and that is to make room for both the past and the future. In music, you still have the tracker scene that was so prominent back in the 90s, where you could read the music in real time and see what instruments were being used. Nowadays, you have DAWs like Ableton and FL Studio that are more accessible in comparison to what was used before. The tracker system would be used to make iconic tracks from games like Deus Ex and Unreal Tournament 99. On the other hand, the AAA industry was moving forward in graphical prowess and modern mechanics. The indie scene, in contrast, went through a rewind period, where we saw an unprecedented number of 8-bit inspired games, some in particular like Shovel Knight and this game. It was like a blast from the past, highly accessible for many PCs, and had restored a method that was once the norm, which were games with dated visuals and relatively simple gameplay. In the case of indie games though, we had also started seeing new mechanics that were being created by their respective developers. Fez played around with dimensions and changed how we perceive 2D games. Braid was a unique take on puzzle games with the rewinding mechanic. Superhot with its time stop mechanic. And of course, Minecraft, the most successful indie game of all time. And Cave Story, a reminder that all it takes is dedication and faith in your ability to create something, which this man did all by himself. And finally, Undertale with its approach to pacifism and genocide in the guise of mechanics. There are many of these indie games that have all made their own impacts on rising trends, and we've quite literally seen shifts in the bit department. We've gone from 8 to 16-bit games, and for almost a decade, we've seen a sea of PS1 inspired games. If you ask me, it's only a matter of time before we start seeing Dreamcast and PS2 inspired indie games. Mark my words. While the indie train has become its own beast, there is another entity that has been manifesting in the bowels of itch.io since 2015, a world that encapsulates the history of the retro gaming period between the 70s and to some extent the early 90s. I am talking about the world of fantasy consoles. Now, it's a term that not a great deal of people have heard of, and no, it's not the same as fantasy football, so take your bets elsewhere. What is a fantasy console exactly? Well, you take the concept of an emulator and an engine, you put them together, and then you have what is called a fantasy console. People can create and play games on the same platform, but the catch is that it's for a platform that technically never existed. They have no official hardware to speak of. Fantasy consoles are consoles that only exist as software, but they have all of the components that constitute a gaming console, like machine specifications, display formats, development tools, design culture, distribution, and communities that are cultivated by its players. The main concepts in mind for the development of this approach to game development are comprised of two core elements: retro limitations and accessibility. The fantasy console that I'll be talking about in this video and is the main subject is the Pico 8, which is the most popular and widely used fantasy console out there as we speak. If you've ever lurked within the indie gaming scene or just on itch.io in general, you may have come across this name or games associated with Pico 8. Otherwise, I will dive into the system and also talk about where it originally came from. Pico 8 is a fantasy console developed by Lexawful Games. The creator, Joseph White, has been developing programs all the way back in '93, where he created his first shareware game called Try. The idea of shareware was mostly known from the original Doom, where people via mail order or word of mouth could obtain a copy of the game. Over the years, after developing more games for the DOS system, there would be a break period for him before he returned to game development, which at that point in the early 2000s would create the earliest piece of software that could be evidenced as the first fantasy console, called Pico, which was a tool that integrated sprite, voxel, and audio tools comprised of the C library called Kodo. There was also another virtual machine called Lex 500, which would exist to sow the seeds for the realization of Pico 8 that wouldn't come until 2015, but its eventual release would also be impacted from the work of another project made by the same person, called Voxatron. What originally started as an arena shooter would be transformed into a platform of its own, where people could make their own voxel-based games. While that was being worked on, the focus for the project to spearhead the fantasy console concept into the world would come to be, in his most well-known work thus far, a platform that has spawned thousands of games, the Pico 8. Since 2015, this platform has been worked on, modified, and has even been given tools to further expand its capabilities without straying from its own core principles, which was to bring back a familiar feeling of retro console gaming and to maximize creativity even in the presence of its limitations. Speaking of which, the Pico 8 is an incredibly limiting platform. On the one hand, it can be an incredible turnoff for aspiring developers that wish to have more freedom in the type of game that they wish to make. And on the other, this could be seen as a great opportunity to see how far one could go with its limiting factors. I will go more into this subject later on, but the main idea here is that the Pico 8 is by all accounts a retro platform, something that is reflective of the earlier stages of gaming, where you could only make games with what was available, but you can't have a platform without the products, right? Which is where all of the games come in. Pico 8's library is huge and is potentially endless, and the best part about it, it's free. But if you want to develop games for it, then you need to buy Pico 8, either off of the website of Lexophil Games or on itch.io. In any case, you can still access the large number of games on the pages of itch.io or on the main website. Just go into the games tab on itch.io and then scroll through the tag until you find Pico 8, profit. Anyway, if you did happen to buy a copy of Pico 8, then you have access to its full capabilities, quite literally as you're about to see soon. When you boot it up, it comes off like a command line interface. Don't panic, just call for help, as in type help, which then gives you a list of commands to type in. What you'll want to type in is Splore, which is Pico 8's browser. From here on, you can find any game that you wish, or type in specific keywords if you're looking for a particular game. Good luck finding the original Celeste on here though. The lists for that game are comprised of modified versions of the games. Fun fact, the Celeste that you know today, the 2018 version to be specific, originally came from the Pico 8, as well as a sequel game called Celeste 2, that would be released as a celebration of the success of the 2018 version of Celeste. Now, the 2018 version that I'm referring to was ported to a different engine as a result of not being able to make a fully fledged game for the Pico 8. You could say that it was a more realized version of the original concept. And you see, the biggest thing that you will find about the library of the Pico 8 games is that they are small. But they do come in different shapes, from platformers to shooters, RPGs, card games, recreations of other games like Mario, Sonic, or even Tetris. Not to mention demakes of Alone in the Dark and Hollow Knight, as well as Doom. The ideas are near infinite, but the execution is finite because of the limitations surrounding the platform. There were quite a few games that I found to be impressive here, and I'm going to go over a few of the most notable ones that come to mind. Also, the platform supports controllers as well as keyboards. For the most part, I would highly recommend getting your hands on a controller if you want the most optimal experience when it comes to Pico 8 gaming. Poom by Fred72. Classic Doom, the game that has been ported more times than GTA 5 and Skyrim combined, now is recreated into the Pico 8 platform. Out of all the ones that I've played, this is one of the most impressive looking Pico 8 games I've played besides Alone in Pico. You start off in the first level hangar with your shotgun, and you go off into the UAC wilderness killing off enemies. It's short and sweet, has the zombies and the imps, but its technical achievements go off to show that the Pico 8 is capable of recreating even a game like Doom. There is, however, only one level available, but it's still classic Doom and it's still fun. Would highly recommend playing this one. Wolfenstein 3D by Hungry Butterfly. Even the grandfather of the FPS genre here gets the Pico 8 treatment. and you have the same dinner plates, German soldiers to shoot with your pistol, and if you've played Doom, then it's the same deal here, except they're demons in World War II uniforms and probably say Mein Leben somewhere in the Pico 8 code, since voices don't really get used here in the Pico 8 fantasy console. Like Poom, it's really well made. And also like Poom, there is only one level. And before I repeat it once more, I will just set the record straight with these games. They are very short. You can beat Pico 8 games from anywhere between 10 to 30 minutes, depending on the project. And every other game that I mention or show will also be around the same length. But still, this adaptation of Wolfenstein 3D is definitely worth a playthrough. Pico Hot. Now, I loved the first Super Hot, and Super Hot VR was an absolute treat. I have mixed feelings with Mind Control Delete, but not with Pico Hot. Pico Hot is another faithful adaptation of an existing game that was unique and fun at the same time. 3 members of the Super Hot team would look at the Pico 8 and decide to basically port their game of Super Hot into the Pico 8, therefore Pico Hot. This project implements the same time stop mechanic where time only moves when you do. The white and red aesthetic is also there and it's spot on. The animations and the functions of the weapons as well as the combat are reflective of the original Super Hot experience, even down to the conversations that you have on the computer. You have a few short levels, and the last one can be challenging unless you're experienced with the series. Another impressive Pico 8 game that also utilizes some extent of 3D modeling, a thing that we will get into later on. Hitbox by Vlad Kormalau. The Pico 8 is also capable of fighting games, even remaking Street Fighter 2, which I thought was okay. But this game was another thing entirely. It's a fighting game where you have a customizable model and 3 settings to fight in. 2 things I noticed right off the bat were its amazing animations, which were incredibly fluid and dynamic, and the 3D modeling of the players in combat. You have a flurry of punches and 2 different kicks. For a Pico 8 game, where the domain is predominantly 8-bit based or 16-bit sometimes, this is an impressive display of showing early 3D style gameplay, and given the limitations of this platform, it goes to show how much effort went into this project. Would highly recommend this one if you're looking for a fighting game on the Pico 8. Virtua Racing D-Make, also made by Fred72. Pico 8's display of early 3D gameplay can also be seen in the racing realm, and Virtua Racing was one of the earliest examples of such. Now, while it was impressive for a game like this to be ported into the Pico 8, I'm gonna be honest here. I cannot see a fucking thing most of the time. Keeping my eyes open without straining them has never been so difficult for me until I came across this game. Nevertheless, it handles well for an old 3D racing game. You can even play on different maps that each have their own setting going for it. Would still recommend having a look at this game, and would also recommend an appointment at the optometrist afterwards. Celeste Classic and Celeste 2 by Maddie Makes Games. Now, I quite enjoyed the remake of Celeste. It had a compelling narrative with a great soundtrack and a great balance of platforming with a puzzle approach to each section. As for the classics, they still hold up even now. I didn't play them much, but I could tell that Celeste Classic was the golden child of the Pico 8, a game that inspired its own devs to make an even better version of that game. And to celebrate the success of the 2018 game, like I said, they ended up making a sequel game for the Pico 8, Celeste 2, which gives you a different character with a hook rather than the dash that changes your hair color for some reason. They're both quite challenging, but has the most bang for your buck when it comes to the library of Pico 8 games. And also, the sprite work is fantastic. Some of the best that I've seen on this platform. Would recommend checking them both out, especially if you've already played the 2018 Celeste. Alone in Pico by Nusan. Now, I brought this up in my D-Make video, but I'm going to talk about it again anyway because it's one of my favorite Pico projects. Alone in Pico is a D-Make based on the original Alone in the Dark game released in '92, but it's only a part of it, mind you, and although you have 2 different characters, there's really no difference between them besides their gender. In any case, you try to get out of the house without being caught by the monsters. In the original, you could fight them or use objects to block their way of getting in. In this game though, you can only just block them in and you can't fight them. If they get you, you die, that's it. So you have to smartly navigate each room, and backtrack where you have key items to reveal other items that you need in order to get out. The original Alone in the Dark was the game to implement fixed cameras and tank controls, 2 core components that Resident Evil would improve upon later on. The Pico 8 D-Make does an amazing job with bringing parts of the gameplay, the setting and the graphics of the original Alone in the Dark to life. It's one of the few 3D Pico 8 games that truly stand out. And if you want to see the platform push to its limits, check this game out. Now, I could go on and on here, but there are way too many games to cover, and other games that I didn't mention. But I will provide links for the other games in the description that I would also recommend. The main take here is that the Pico 8 library is vast, dynamic, but also limited in its capabilities. You won't really find a fully fledged experience like you would in other platforms or other engines. And I don't think that was really the point to begin with, because retro games back in the day were incredibly short anyways, but were longer arbitrarily due to the difficulty of those games. Games like the original NES Ninja Gaiden trilogy, Ghosts and Goblins, Castlevania 3 were all pretty brutal games in their time. In saying that though, that's not to say that Pico 8 is designed to break your balls, but rather to invoke those old memories of a period where gaming was somewhat simpler and didn't have anything more to prove than they do now. I've mentioned that fantasy consoles are also like engines, where you could make games for the platform. Well, this is how all of those games I mentioned were made. Pico 8 has a built-in tool system, having its own IDE for coding, where the primary language is Lua, one of the most accessible programming languages that you can find for game development. You also have a built-in sprite editor where you can make all of your assets, giving you the means to get creative with your pixels, and saves you the hassle of having to import PNG files from another program. Pico 8 has 16 different colors to pick from, and they're all nice selections, striking a good balance between light and dark colors. And finally, you have a music maker to make all of your Pico 8 chiptunes. Its layout can be confusing, and if you're used to DAWs, this will be a different method entirely of making music. However, if you do come from the tracker music scene, or have made chiptunes before, then you'll be fine. The Explore browser curates the library of Pico 8 games for you, as well as allowing you to do a number of different things, such as making a game your favorite, resetting the cart, and best of all, being able to check out its source code once you've loaded up the cart. With just about every Pico 8 game, you can go into the editor, look through the lines of code written, as well as all of the sprites and the sounds made for that particular game. This is one of my favorite things about Pico 8 because it gives you an opportunity to have a closer look at what's behind the scenes and seeing how it all fits together. Another thing too is that you can modify the existing sprites, sound, and source code and make a customized version of said game. Just look at all of the Celeste clones that you can find in the Explore menu and you'll see what I mean. Given how accessible the platform is, and also due to the fact that you can reference other games, this makes it one of the easier platforms to develop games on. There are plenty of resources available online, and I'll provide those sources in the description as well. You can also join the Discord as well for any inquiries too. As for the developing side of games, you can port your project as a HTML game that you can display on your itch.io webpage, or export it as a P8 file, which is a format for P8 cartridges, or have it integrated into the Explore search system. Just remember to save your projects though, as you work on them over time. The utilities of Pico 8 make it an all-in-one package, making a space for developers and people that just want to try out the games made for it. The simpler language of Lua also makes it a great starting point for people looking for an entry-level approach to game development and coding. The sprite work system is comprehensible and easy to use. The music maker, though, is something that will take more time because of its use of channels and patterns, rather than just making notes for a piano roll that you would find in a DAW. I would highly recommend taking a peek through those systems. Start by selecting a game, any game, or better yet, a smaller scale project so that you can see how it was built, how the sprites were made, and same goes for the music. And like I said, you can modify it too and see the immediate effects play out in the project. Now, not all Pico 8 projects are games. Some are just either tutorials or demo reels that show a detailed looking background. Well, detailed for Pico 8 standards anyways. But you also have projects that are so small that they are as small as a tweet. Yes, those tweets. Pico 8 has had developers create what are called Tweetcarts. They are akin to a demo reel, something that is of a visual spectacle to showcase the capabilities of a program, i.e. the showcases for Unreal 5. In the case of Pico 8, these demo reels are fitted into a Tweetcart with a wide array of visuals, written with little more than 256 characters of code. When it's finished, it's then exported as a GIF and is then put on the internet, usually on Twitter. For a platform that is dressed around the concept of being a retro console, These Tweetcarts look incredible, and the color palette of Pico 8 add a vibrance to the platform that makes it stand out in comparison to its sources of inspiration. Within Pico 8's parameters, you can draw whatever you want, and with time and effort into tinkering your code and your sprites, you can make stuff like this. There's not a great deal more beyond what you're seeing though. It's the same as looking at any other GIF on the internet really. The results, however, speak for themselves. I'll provide a link in the description for a page that can get you started in knowing how to make a Tweetcart, as well as showing what code and techniques you can use to bring your sprites to life. Over 4,000 Pico 8 games are predominantly 2D in design, and some projects do utilize 3D as well, like Alone in Pico. But how is it done exactly? Well, in the past, you had to work in 3D spaces, manipulating and transforming objects as well as using projection to change the size of distance objects, which is field of view. Also, utilizing the use of a camera and taking depth of field alongside mathematical functions in the code. A lot of projects still required coding to present the image that is 3D in nature, especially in something like Pico, where it's predominantly 2D oriented. Also, I forgot to mention, Blender. This is the best free resource for people that want to model their assets as well as creating more complex animations, like you would see in projects like this. The creator of Alone in Pico had used Blender to make a lot of the meshes and models for the DMake project. At the time, developers that wanted to push 3D into Pico 8 had to resort to other programs like Blender, and then find a way to code it into their project. But now, there is also another option, something that already has Pico 8's limitations established, so that you don't have to essentially recreate Pico 8's graphics from scratch like you would have to in something like Blender. This is PicoCAD, which is basically Blender for Pico 8. It was created by Johan Peitz in an effort to give Pico 8 its own 3D modeling platform, where developers could make 3D models for their own games in Pico 8. Compared to the complexity and overwhelming nature of Blender, this is essentially a Diet Coke experience in comparison, and is incredibly easy to use. You have a preset of shapes to choose from, that you can then use to manipulate into whatever object you see fit. But there are no sphere shapes. You have to manipulate a cylinder in order to do so, as you can see here. Afterwards, you then go into the mesh section and apply your textures. Again, this is fairly easy because all you have to do is import a PNG file by dragging it straight into PicoCAD. From there, you can then texture your model. That's it. The rest of the difficulty just comes down to creativity. Of course, you don't necessarily have to use this software. Other developers figured it out with their own projects before PicoCAD was even created. But PicoCAD just makes 3D assets easier to obtain because the shapes and textures are filtered within Pico 8's limitations. Otherwise, you would have to do a lot more manual work to get the Pico 8 aesthetic if you were using something like Blender. If you want to learn how to make a shitty looking sphere like mine here, then look no further than PicoCAD. It's such a useful resource for Pico 8 development. Part of retro gaming's appeal is nostalgia. It can remind you of an earlier period in your life where older graphics and simpler gameplay were the norm. Thanks to emulation, we can still enjoy these games as they once were. And while these consoles still exist, they are finite in their workability as well as availability. And good luck finding replacement parts if your Dreamcast gets fried during an electrical surge. Emulation doesn't have that problem, and neither does Pico 8. Since it is a console made entirely of software. Now, if you didn't grow up with older consoles, then that is fine, because you can still grasp what the creator was trying to replicate with Pico 8, and how it provides a link to the past, so to speak. The library of games bounced from Atari-style graphics all the way up to very early 3D games. The 8 to 16-bit wave of indie games were able to invoke a memory that was never there, and the concepts of fantasy consoles also play into this idea, of remembering a console, or playing games on a console that never actually existed. Like DMakes, fantasy consoles also give us a window into what early gaming used to look like, but revitalizing the scene with new ideas and new projects. It is something that is familiar but fresh. It was a concept that was being marinated and worked on since the early 2000s, and it seems to have finally paid off with Pico 8. The fantasy console that would kickstart the trend and even inspire the creation of other fantasy consoles that you can find on itch.io. Also, I should mention too that these fantasy consoles have also been ported into homebrew hardware, as you can see here, transforming it into either a portable console or a home console like you would have back in the day. I'll provide a link in the description to show how it's done. The fantasy consoles all provide a nostalgic feeling, taking into account early game design with limited graphics and memory space in order to complete a project. And that's the word I've used a lot in this video. Limits and limitations, which I will now get into. You look at any game on Pico 8 and you'll see that they look very retro, play very retro, and are small, if not smaller than something you'd play on the Atari 2600 or the NES. The resolution limit is 128 by 128. You have only 16 colors to choose from. The files for Pico 8 games are within the kilobyte or megabyte range, meaning that they occupy very little space even on the smallest of computers. The tile map is 128 by 32, and the pixel sprites are also 128 by 128. So now you can see what you have to work with here. It can easily be a turn-off for someone that prefers more flexibility in their workspace. It's the reason why a lot of people use Unity, because of the amount of freedom it provides for whatever game you want without the worry of limitations. But Pico 8 quite literally was made to be a retro platform, and its limited factors reflect an earlier period in game development when the tech wasn't anything like it is today. In saying that though, I actually think that the limitations of Pico 8 are its biggest strength. The reason is because it doesn't use the retro visuals as an aesthetic like a lot of indie games do. It goes beyond that and builds upon specifications that resemble the likes of the NES or earlier devices like the Atari 2600. It forces you to get comfortable within its own parameters, where the focus should be more on being as creative as possible despite those limitations. Plenty of projects on Pico 8 can go from amateurish prototypes to genuinely impressive projects like Poom and Alone in Pico. And like I said, the games are really short, which is a result of memory space and the limits to how many tokens you can have in your code. It's not for everyone though, and the project may evolve to a point where Pico 8 can no longer accommodate the size of it, which is what happened with Celeste, when the developers realized their project could be even bigger. Pico 8 can either be a prototyping platform, or just something that you're content to make small games or small projects with. Personally, limits are quite beneficial when you first get started in game development. It gives you breathing room to focus on the fundamentals, and it doesn't overwhelm you in the way programs like Unity, Unreal, or Blender do. There is no benefit with flexibility if you don't know what to do with it in the first place, which is why Pico 8 could be a great starting point for people wanting to tip their toes into game development. Not to mention too that you can read through the source code of other games and modify it like I said. But if you're already an experienced developer, then the only thing that will be an obstacle at first is being able to read the retro font that Pico 8 has going for it. Since the release of Pico 8, the itch.io platform has also seen other fantasy consoles or even fantasy computers like the TIC-80, another popular platform inspired by the Commodore 64 and other platforms similar to it. Each of them have varying specifications that either seem more relaxed and flexible, or far more limiting than even the Pico 8. The Pico 8's predecessor, the Voxotron, can still be used to make voxel-based games for anyone interested in that. The creator behind Pico 8 is developing another fantasy console called the Picotron, which is a more advanced version of the Pico 8 that combines that and the Voxeltron together. It is to be the last one made, and I really look forward to its eventual release to see how it compares to the Pico 8 itself. The only caveat with the other platforms here is that their communities are nowhere near as big, and finding help can be more difficult. All that means though is that there is still room for exploration of these platforms, and there are people as well as the developers themselves that you can reach out to if you have any questions or need advice regarding your project. Each fantasy console or computer have their strengths and weaknesses, and at the end of the day you're looking at a very niche category of indie game development, something that has only come to light since 2015. I'll provide a link as well to the page where you can find these platforms so that you can see what else the realm of fantasy consoles and computers have to offer. The Pico 8 is one of the most interesting projects I've seen in indie development. It feels like a complete restoration of a time where the older and dated graphics and gameplay from decades long ago was really all we had. Now we have close to real-life graphics, or a varying degree of unique art styles that give the gaming industry different flavors. Fantasy consoles though, like D-Makes, look to rewind the clock and bring back a more nostalgic time period. It was built for the retro gaming scene in both its code, its sprite and sounds, to the final products released on it. Retro graphics are seen frequently in the indie scene, and some are quite authentic like Shovel Knight. another fantastic 8-bit inspired platformer that made a big impact during its time. But Pico does more than just what you see on the surface level. It brings forth an idea to make a console that never existed, something that you could only find in the digital space. It is both an engine and an emulator, making or creating games where both developers and gamers coexist and even influence each other across the Pico 8 spectrum. Gamers have full access to the games, being able to modify code, sprites and sounds, which is not often seen in almost any game ever made, where the source code is generally closed off. It's easily accessible for gamers too that wish to transition into development, has a thriving community and tons of resources and tools to make your projects easier to make. Pico 8 is an amazing project with a truly unique approach to bringing retro gaming to life. Fantasy consoles and computers are something that should continue to be expanded on, because the potential for further generations of console gaming are right around the corner. Imagine what fantasy console equivalents of the PS1 and the N64 would look like. It would be amazing to see, especially since we've seen so many PS1 inspired games as of late. It's a concept that's still growing, forever expanding, and always remaining in the past. Thank you for watching.